Hallo Leute, ich bin Katja und ihr seht Deutsch für euch. Remember to watch the introductory episode on tenses before you even get started on this one, because that one will give you the overview you need for tenses in German. So today I'm going to get started on our first past tense, of which there are two in total, the Präteritum and the Perfekt. In most languages you would probably start with the equivalent to the Präteritum, which in English would be the normal past tense, but I decided to start with the Perfekt instead because in my opinion that is actually the more important tense if you actually want to end up communicating in German. So we're going to do that first today. Okay, enough introduction. What's the deal with this tempus? Well, the name would suggest that it is connected to at least one of your perfect tenses, present perfect and past perfect. The thing is, it's not really an equivalent to either one of them. Like I mentioned, many native German English learners get a headache when first learning about the present perfect precisely because of this misconception. The reason their names are so similar is because they are built the same. You take a form of sein or haben, so to be or to have, and you combine it with a participle of your main verb, so the verb that expresses the meaning. That is the reason for the similarity, not their usage. Very important. Before getting back into how to use it, I have to make sure that all of you know how to form the perfect. Like I mentioned, for that we use one of the two Hilfsverben sein or haben, and we combine it with the Partizip zwei, participle to, of our main verb. For those of you who have already encountered that, that is the so-called G-form. If you don't already know, and by that I mean precisely know, what the participle to does in German, pause this video now and instead go to this one, in which I will take you through how to form the G-form and also what it does in German. For this video, it's time to take a look at how to use the perfect in German. Like I implied earlier, the perfect is the past tense in spoken language about 80 to 90% of the time. No guarantee on those numbers though. That means that you will use this tense most of the time when you're speaking to somebody about some kind of past event, while when you're writing a story or actually just dealing in written language in general, most of the time you will use the tense that I will talk about next week, the Präteritum. There are some rare occasions on which we do use the Präteritum in spoken language as well. That will be when we're telling a story as if we were telling it from a book, so to say. So for example, if you were to tell a fairy tale and want to make it more magic, and also in some very intuition-based instances that, you know, most people probably wouldn't even be able to describe why they do it. I will talk about that more next week though. And also very importantly, in official language. So that means when you're in a professional or an official setting, you're best off not to use the perfect. But once again, nobody will demand your social death if you do end up using the perfect. Depending on the situation, you might come across as a bit distanzlos, as we say, meaning that, you know, people might assume that you do not know how to keep the proper distance in an official setting. So in those scenarios, the perfect is rarely used, and when it is, it most often is used like you can use the present perfect in English, and that is to talk about things that happened in the past but still somehow affect the present. Haben Sie die Unterlagen kopiert? But this is another point at which I would like to say, don't panic, breathe, and just let it come to you. This information is mostly for situations in which you would otherwise end up going something like, but I thought you were supposed to use that other tense. I don't think there are that many Germans out there who actually know why they use which tense, except for the fact that they want to express a certain time stage. So knowing that, which time stage you're on and which tenses work for that is completely fine for the beginning, because there's always going to be some Klugscheißer who corrects you on the details if you need it. The much more important thing about using the perfect correctly is that it can be used with two Hilfsverben, sein or haben. The tricky thing, and also the thing that could end up making you sound more clueless than any professional setting ever could, is knowing when to use which one of them. The good news is, the vast majority of verbs are used with haben in the perfect. Yay! The bad news is that the ones that are used with sein are pretty important and frequently used for the most part. So let's take a look. Verbs that are always used with haben and that you can therefore mark off your risk list right away are: number 1, verbs that always have an Akkusativobjekt following them. Example, sehen. Ich sehe dich turns into ich habe dich gesehen. Number 2, reflexive verbs. Remember them? I just recently put out an episode on them. In case you missed that, watch that first. This goes for both regular and irregular reflexive verbs. Example, sich konzentrieren. Ich konzentriere mich turns into ich habe mich konzentriert. If you don't know why there was no G in front of konzentriert, rewatch the extra on the G form again, because I talked about that in there. And then number 3, each scenario in which one of the modal Hilfsverben is used as a full verb. Careful though, this scenario is pretty rare. Example, wollen. Das will ich nicht turns into das habe ich nicht gewollt. So that covers a big part already. Plus, like I already said, since the vast majority use haben, if you're ever not sure, your better guess is just to go with haben. But now, the groups that always use sein to form the perfect are all movements, so all verbs that indicate that somebody is moving from A to B or even just around, just moving in general. Example, gehen. Ich gehe zur Schule turns into ich bin zur Schule gegangen. Secondly, all verbs that indicate a change in state. So that means if I used to be standing up but am now seated, my state has changed through sitting down. If I used to be a child but am now an adult, my state has changed through growing up. If that makes a better visual for you, you could even still think of these as a movement, as a transition from one state into another. Example, wachsen, to grow. Die Pflanze wächst turns into die Pflanze ist gewachsen. And lastly, a group of verbs that don't have anything to do with the former 2 groups, but luckily there aren't that many of them, so you can just learn these by heart. And that is where we'll leave it at for today. There's another thing I could have mentioned that I like to call perfect expert mode, but I think that would be overdoing it for today. You won't need it for now anyway, but let me know if you would be interested in a video on that in the future. Also, to get your own copy of the script for this episode, support me on Patreon, which is always linked in the description, and toss me a note with an email address that you use for Dropbox. Your random word of the week is, since I don't have one here, I'm just gonna mimic it. Die Wäscheleine. Bis nächste Woche. Tschüss!